everybody feeling refreshed and ready for the day. We are so grateful to Dad Saves America and all of our sponsors today, which you're going to learn more throughout as we go through. So I think it's really interesting because when we started thinking about the theme of this summit almost a year ago, we started thinking about families, the role of families, and the role of each generation in the family. And as we unpacked this, we started to see that with each generation comes a unique set of challenges. And so we are going to have an amazing panel. I want to welcome our panelists to come on stage right now because they are really going to unpack for us. Hopefully I'm still live. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Hopefully they're going to unpack for us really the power, right, of family and the impact that it has on the outcomes for children. So I am very excited to welcome you all to the stage, and thank you so much for joining us today for our panel that families still matter. So I want to start by introducing Melissa Kearney. You may have seen her in the news quite frequently. She is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland and Director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, and Dr. Kearney's research really focuses on the economics of families, fertility, poverty, and inequality. And her new book is making waves. You have probably seen many reviews and op-eds and some wonderful pieces you've published as well called The Two-Parent Privilege. So we're really excited to hear from you today. Let's welcome Melissa. Mark Merrill is joining us. He is the founder and president of Family First, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people love their families well. That's a great mission, by the way. He serves as the host of the Family Minute with Mark Merrill, a nationally syndicated radio program. He's appeared on Fox and Friends, Fox News, NBC Today Show, numerous ABC, CBS, you've covered it all. You've been in them all, that's great. And national radio programs. Mark and his wife Susan co-wrote 2 parenting journals, 2 marriage books, and he's the author of All Pro Dads, 7 Essentials to Being a Hero to Your Kids, among many other books. So thank you for being here, Mark. Brad Wilcox, you've also probably seen a little bit about Brad in the news these days, is part of this national debate we're hearing about. He's a professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. So I am excited to dig in because Dr. Wilcox is the author and co-editor of 5 books, including Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites. That's coming out, in February? All right, so it's good. Forge Strong Families and Save Civilization. Those 2 at the end are key. And Gender and Parenthood, a biological and social scientific perspective. So we are extremely fortunate to have these remarkable experts here with us today. So thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Kearney, we're going to start with you. The Two-Parent Privilege, How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind is your book title. I have found the media and public reaction to your book both predictable and then a little astounding at times. I'm sure you have as well. The Washington Post reviewer thinks you're trapped by convention. I'm sorry to hear that for you. And a lack of imagination. She suggests and said we try a communal model to parenting. And the New York Magazine said both you and Brad, so y'all are in good company, really are flat out wrong. So you ought to feel good about that. So I think this is such an awesome opportunity to hear directly from 2 of you because this is a conversation that is in the news and you're going to be hearing more about it. But Dr. Kearney, why is your straightforward message, backed by decades of research, why is that even controversial? And what story does the data tell us about the trends in marriage?
Thanks, Stacy. So I agree with you entirely that the negative reaction to my book is both entirely predictable and yet a bit astounding. I really come at this as an economist, and for 20 years I've been part of policy conversations about inequality and poverty in America, and it is abundantly clear that we need to be talking about what has happened to the family in the context of these conversations. But the major pushback I'm getting is really just an ideological commitment from a certain set of writers who reject the notion that single parents, mostly single moms, can't provide just as well for their kids as two parents or married parents. And my response is, while it is obviously completely true that there are lots of single moms who have done an amazing job giving their children resource-filled lives, and those kids have gone on and been phenomenally successful, we cannot deny the mounds of data and evidence showing that kids who have the benefit of growing up with two parents in their home are much more likely to thrive and hit all sorts of markers of success. And so my argument is entirely data and evidence driven. And I find the reaction, which is really just a denial of facts, to be completely counterproductive to the goal of helping families and children in this current country flourish. So what are some of the major trends that the data show that I highlight in my book? Well, one, something remarkable has happened in the past 40 years in this country, which is that the share of kids growing up with married parents has declined from 77% to 63%. That is a dramatic change in the way kids in this country are growing up. It is not the case that this has been made up for with kids living with two parents who are essentially committed in long-term cohabiting relationships. Only 8% of kids in the US today live with unmarried parents, and in about a quarter to 40%, that's not, the second parent is not their biological parent. It's just one parent and their parent's romantic partner. Rather, we have 30% of US kids living outside a two-parent home. Okay, this is more than in any other country in the world. About 21% of kids live with their mom and no other adult, another 5% live with their dad and no other adult, and another about 4.5% live with neither parent. This is a crisis for American kids and families, and we need to confront it. The second thing I'll highlight is that this trend has happened primarily outside college-educated class. Okay, and so it's, college-educated, the most economically successful women in society, they are still in large numbers and very similar shares to 40 years ago, raising their kids in married parent homes. It's non-college educated women with lower levels of earnings and education, who now are finding themselves, 30% of them, doing the hard work of raising their kids on their own. This is not a feminist success story. And the final thing I'll say in terms of aggregate trends, I show this in the book. Very mechanically, this has contributed to an erosion of middle-class economic security, now that those households are 23 percentage points more likely to only have one potential earner in the household. And it's amplified class gaps and inequality in this country. You've got college-educated adults bringing in really high earnings, marrying each other, showering an abundance of resource on their kids, and increasingly outside those classes, you have economically vulnerable individuals setting up their own households. They just don't have the resources to offer their kids anything like what the kids of college-educated parents are getting. And so anyone interested in equity, inequality, class gaps really needs to confront what's happened to the family.
And there's been a reluctance, right, to add this element to the conversation when you talk about poverty. Brad, I'm going to turn to you, because talk to me about why this obviously has been such an important issue for you to bring to the forefront of conversation, like the element of family. How does that interplay with poverty and education, really the future of America? And then follow up with that, if you don't mind. Why is there such hypocrisy and inconsistency between what we hear from maybe academia or certain policymakers and then actually how they live their lives?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. So, I kind of got into this business probably much, like Melissa did, out of a concern for kind of how this plays out for kids. I was raised by a single mom. I think she did a pretty good job with me and my sister. But I'm also a sociologist, and I kind of recognize and appreciate how much strong families matter for kids. And so what we're seeing in the data, for instance, is that when it comes to kind of the American dream, and looking at kind of trends in communities across this country, Raj Studies' work at Harvard tells us the number one factor that kind of predicts whether or not kids rise, have that kind of rags to riches mobility, is the share of two-parent families in their communities. So it's kind of integral to our country here to have that playing out. But obviously there's more to life than money. And what we're seeing for adults in the United States, and I'm kind of thinking a lot more about adults these days, in part because my students at UVA, particularly my female students at UVA, are expressing more concern to me about their prospects for marriage in the future on a variety of fronts. We can talk about that more later. But the point is that in the data, what we're seeing is that there's been a drop in happiness for adults in the US. And so if we kind of take seriously Jefferson's kind of discussion of the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration, we should be cognizant of the way in which happiness is falling in America. And we know from research the number one factor, again, that explains this drop in happiness in America is the fact that fewer American adults are finding their way towards the altar. So thinking about kind of just sort of the nature of this, this American way of life, we have to recognize that a lot of what we take for granted here in this country depends upon strong families. Now, in terms of your point about kind of elites, I think that the weird reality is they tend to talk left and walk right on family, right? Talk left, walk right. I mean, if I had $1 for every journalist, professor, Hollywood mogul, and school superintendent who denied or discounted the importance of marriage and family in public, even as they're benefiting from a strong family in private, I'd be a very rich man, right? So I think what's going on here is a couple of things. I'll just mention three. One is that I think all of us have family complexity of one sort or another, either in our own lives, the lives of our family and friends, and so it's a hard issue for us to kind of talk about and tackle. I think that's got to be put out there. But there is obviously kind of a broader progressive assumption there out today that kind of every single innovation, change, that's sort of happening to our families is got to be baptized as good. And so we can't have kind of hard and serious conversations like the one that Melissa's having with us this morning for fear of kind of coming across as, not progressive. And then the third thing, though, that I would say is that people who are particularly more educated, more affluent, have either an explicit or a tacit recognition that despite this sort of progressive mindset out there, it's still much more prudent to organize your life around a stable married family, both for yourself and especially for the welfare of your children. So I think that helps explain why we are seeing this kind of weird dynamic where a lot of folks, again, can be found kind of opining in very progressive ways about family diversity, for instance, in public, and yet living very neo-traditional lives in the privacy of their own household.
Interesting. Not surprising, but interesting. Mark, as an author of books on marriage and parenting and really working for decades on Family First and All Pro Dad, what trends are you seeing as it relates to people's attitudes about marriage that you work with, the impact you see that on the family and the children, and then fewer marriages and the role of dads and perhaps the absentee father issue that we see? Talk to me about the work you're doing in that area and why it matters so much.
First of all, I'm really astounded by being with Brad and Melissa, and you, Stace, as well, because I'm feeling like a donkey in the Kentucky Derby, I'm not sure I should be running with these thoroughbreds, but I'm glad to be with them. So really, I'm learning a lot on stage just being here with you guys, and look forward to working with you. Also, I have, real quickly, Stace, got to give a shout out to the reason why Susan, my wife, and I are here is because of Elizabeth Fowler. Samantha, great to see you as well, Samantha Fowler and the Triad Foundation. So you guys are awesome, always. And my wife and my girlfriend are here today, so I'm very grateful for that. Susan, where are you? You're somewhere around here, so thank you. For the last 33 years, Susan and I have been working together at Family First. She is the Chief Program Marketing Officer. And what we've observed is massive attitude shifts and changes just in that 33-year period. And what we're seeing is really overall a dismissive attitude towards marriage. And there's a couple things that I think are going on here. First of all, a lot of people today really don't understand the meaning of marriage. They really don't understand the meaning of marriage. Well, what is that? What is that? Well, it's based on the truths since the beginning of humankind that marriage is a God-ordained institution between God, a husband, and wife. So that's the worldview that I come from in understanding that. So they don't understand the meaning of marriage. Also, the institution of marriage has been devalued significantly in our culture today. And we don't need to, look to all the different sources as to why it's been devalued. You can look at the entertainment industry, you can look at so-called role models and others in social media and otherwise, and influencers. But suffice to say that what happens when something is devalued? You don't want it anymore, right? And so that's what's happening with marriage. Marriage rates, as you guys shared, are plummeting, while cohabitation is skyrocketing. And as a result of that, what we're also seeing, as you shared, Melissa, is that 40% of all births today are out of wedlock. Okay, so you're tracking ways to meet. So what happens then? 40% of all births out of wedlock, then most of those children grow up without a father. Hence, 1 out of 4 young men and young women today grow up without, not in a two-parent household. They grew up without a father involved in their kids' lives. That's over 18 million kids. So, Stacy, in summary, the impact, you guys know the stats already. Those kids, not always, because Brad's an example of the exception, but most of those kids grow up, they're less likely to perform well in school. They're more likely to live in poverty, more likely to have mental health issues, and more likely to be incarcerated. And by the way, Stacy, these aren't just stats. One example, Tony Dungy, who's a Tampa resident here, and I have been into a number of prisons voluntarily. And we have, when you go into those prisons, what do you realize? You see 70% of all those kids grow up without a dad. So those are real life stories. These aren't just stats that we're throwing out. These are real life stories of children whose lives are being impacted.
So powerful, because you're right, is when we unpack data, right, and we start to dig into trends, at the end of the day, this is about human beings and whether or not they're going to flourish. So, Dr. Kearney, what has your research revealed about the impact specifically on children and, you know, the children from a one-parent household versus a two-parent household? And beyond that immediate impact, what is that long-term outlook? We're talking about some of that here, but what has your research revealed?
Yeah. Well, let me start by presenting an alternative view of marriage, which is how I come to it in my research, which is a long-term economic contract between two individuals to pool their resources and commit to the activity of raising a family together. And in that context, in that resource-based framework, what we see, again, very clearly in nationally representative census data, kids growing up with married parents have many more resources in their household. And so in sort of an econometric statistical sense, what you see is even comparing across the kids of moms who are the same age and have the same education level, the same race, live in the same place, you see that kids, you know, as Mark was saying, who grow up in a single mother household as compared to a married parent household, they're more likely to get in trouble in school, they're more likely to have socio-emotional challenges, they're less likely to graduate high school. The kids of married parents, conditional on mom's age and education, are twice as likely to graduate from a 4-year college. And then in adulthood, they're more likely to have higher earnings and be married themselves. And this is really important because there's this intergenerational transmission here of advantage and disadvantage happening. Now, income is a big part of this story, right? I mean, just in, you know, not just like comparing, looking in the data, kids growing up in single mother households are 5 times more likely to grow up in poverty. In single father households, 3 times more likely. The median income of a married parent household is, unsurprisingly, twice as high as the median income of a single parent family. And income is very protective of kids. It allows families to live in better neighborhoods, have safer housing, access all sorts of enriching educational healthcare investments for their kids. We know that that's a big part of the difference. It's not to say marriage isn't important, but one of the things marriage is doing is bringing the income of 2 parents or the earnings potential of 2 parents into the household. But it's not just income. Again, I'm drawing on data and studies here. We know that kids who are living with married parents have more parental time invested in them. Okay, they get more time from both their mom and their dad, and they get the pooled time. Why? You know, we don't have to lean into any sort of terrible stereotypes that single moms are investing in their kids. If there are 2 parents, there's more time to sit and read to your kid, to drive your kid to activities, to spend time talking to your kid, and all of these things matter for kids' outcomes. And the final sort of bucket of resources that I draw on a lot of evidence in support of is there's just more emotional bandwidth, right? This will feel very intuitive to anyone who's raised kids, but we see, again, in data, in studies, single mother households have higher levels of stress. It's hard to come home at the end of the day, be the only one responsible for paying the bills, getting dinner on the table, dealing with your kid. It's really hard to engage in the kind of parenting that development psychologists say is beneficial for kids, and we see that in the data. Kids from married parent households are more likely to get that kind of nurturing parent. And all of these mechanisms are ways that deliver these better outcomes for kids, basically.
So, Brad, your book highlights 4 groups who are building strong and stable marriages by a higher percentage. I liked in some of your messaging, you said they defy the me first message in favor of family first way of life. Who are those groups, and why do we see those particular groups of people sort of being able to push against the narrative?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of negative, obviously, news to sort of confront, but it's important to sort of understand that there's some good news here, Stacy. And so what I see in my book is there are 4 groups of folks who are doing pretty well on the marriage front, and those are Asian Americans, religious Americans, a group that I call strivers, college-educated Americans who are kind of having a long-term view. And the 4th group is conservative Americans. And when I was kind of going about this project, I didn't actually intend to have this 4th group, conservative Americans, because I don't really want to make the book political.
I think your mic's going in and out. Will you swap with Mark for just a minute? Thanks. I want everybody to hear every word you have to say.
Yeah, so the 4 groups are Asian Americans, religious Americans, what I call the strivers, college-educated Americans, and the 4th group is conservative Americans. And I didn't actually set out to make this story kind of political, but as I was running regressions with the data, what I was finding is that ideology above and beyond even controls for religion and education was predictive of more marriage for conservatives and of happier marriages also for Americans. So it's for that reason that I have these 4 groups in the book. And basically, in different ways, what I think that they do is to prioritize communion in their marriages, to prioritize commitment in their marriages, and then to have that community of like-minded folks who are kind of with them and for them. And those different groups, have and combine these features in ways that advance, as you were saying, more of a we-first approach to marriage rather than a me-first approach. And that we-first approach is much more obviously successful than a me-first approach today.
Awesome. Mark, tell us just real quickly, you're focusing on fatherhood through All Pro Dad. How are you addressing this fatherlessness epidemic? And then really what can we all do, right, as leaders in our communities to try to make sure that we're getting dads more involved?
Stacy, our real vision is for every child to know the love of a mom and a dad. Mm-hmm. And so what our focus is, Family First is our national nonprofit, 33 years, and then All Pro Dad is our fatherhood program. And through that fatherhood program, we really know that what we need to do is meet dads and father figures where they are and engage them with what they need. And so our focus is doing that home to home and state to state. Home to home, where we challenge men who can spend also time with fatherless kids to spend a minute a day consuming our resources, an hour a month attending one of our All Pro Dad chapters, where dads and kids get together with other dads and kids in public schools across the country. And we're in over 1,200 of those schools in 40 states. And then attending a minute a day, an hour a month, and a day a year attending an All Pro Dad event at an NFL or college stadium that we have all across the country. So home to home, and then state to state, we've launched responsible fatherhood initiatives in the state of Florida with the governor. The legislature was behind it, Speaker Sprouls and other leadership in the Florida legislature. And so that's been a really cool thing that we're just getting going and just launching. And then also state to state, we're doing that in Tennessee. We just launched a fatherhood initiative in the state of Texas as well recently, and in Indiana. We're doing that state by state as well. And so any of you guys that aren't in one of those 3 states, please see me. I would love to talk to you about how we can have an impact in in those states as well.
Well, I love that. And the policy circle always likes to take, what are these ideas? How do we unpack this and then put it into practice, right, at that local level? Real quick lightning round. I'm going to start with you, Brad. Which public policy reforms, now this is tough to do in a lightning round, do you feel like is going to help boost marriage rates and support the institution of marriage?
So I think the problem with marriage is partly cultural and partly economic. And what I would say is just quickly three things. One is talking about the success sequence in our public and private schools as well as PSAs. And that's this idea that if you get at least a high school degree, you work full time in your 20s, and get married before having children, your odds of being poor as a young adult are just 3%. And your odds of being in the middle class or higher are 86%. Kind of giving that information to our kids. We've also, on the economic front, got to get rid of marriage penalties in our means-tested programs. Now, what Congress has done is they've eliminated a lot of marriage penalties in the income taxes, but they haven't addressed any of the penalties for means-tested programs. And that's frankly a bit perverse, because we've just been hearing about how it's the upper-income Americans who are doing pretty well on the marriage front. So they've had their marriage penalties addressed, but it's working class and poor Americans who are really struggling, and they've not had those penalties addressed. And the final thing that I would say is we need to be thinking too about kind of housing policies that make not just housing more affordable, but single family housing especially more affordable for working and middle class families across the country. It would make both marriage, especially childbearing, I think more accessible to them. And there's some ideas about zoning that we could talk about on that front.
We'd love a good zoning conversation. We'll pick that back up later. So we talk about housing quite a bit at the policy circle. Mark?
Last night after dinner, and yeah, I cooked dinner, and I'm glad you guys weren't there because it wasn't very good. It was tough, the meat. But my son-in-law and my daughter were both there. He's 35, she's 31, and we sat down and they said, "What are you going to be doing tomorrow? What's up?" And I told them about this event, and we started talking about it, and we said, what's missing? What do we really need to do, not only from a policy perspective but cultural perspective? And they said, well, marriage has been devalued. They see that. These are millennials. And they said, we need to bring the value back into marriage. There needs to be a strong value proposition, a strong value statement that marriage matters more than you can imagine. Marriage matters more than you can imagine. And we need to shout that from the rooftops and bring it into the streets and our neighborhoods and communities all across the nation. And so we need people to understand that there's security in marriage, there's stability, there's permanence, there's even health in marriage, as we've heard all the statistics. So that's really what we believe we need to do, and have these massive national campaigns, and maybe that starts state by state as well. The other thing, in terms of a policy perspective, this is your arena, the two of you, but I asked my focus group last night at dinner, and I said, well, what would you guys do? They said, well, what if there was more incentive, and there was this value proposition incentive from that standpoint, and not just penalties for what people shouldn't do, but also incentives for what they should do. And they said, well, what if people got married and they got like one big lump tax credit the first year of marriage? They're serious. Yeah. And then they said, maybe if you stayed married 10 years, then you get another tax credit, and then 20 years and 30 years. So let's adopt that.
I love it.
All in favor? Say aye. Yeah? Okay, good. Done deal.
I've been married 25 years. No taxes. Perfect.
Yeah.
Dr. Kearney, I want to finish with you.
Yeah. I'm a public finance economist, and I teach taxes to my students, but I'm gonna refrain from talking about all the things that should be changed in the tax code. But I'll start by just acknowledging, I think the trends have been massive. I am all for removing, our tax code and our transfer programs do have marriage disincentives baked in, unless the bottom line is actually our marriage subsidizes marital arrangements where one parent stays home. But if you have two workers in the household, you actually pay a higher tax burden. We should get rid of all that. But my read of that is this will matter a little bit on the margins. And I think the bigger changes has to do with what you were saying. We need a societal-wide shift. But changing the social norm isn't going to be enough either, because there has been a reduction in the economic value proposition of marriage outside the college-educated class. Okay, a lot of these people are not getting married because the men are not stably employed. 15% of prime-age men are not working right now, right? And so all of the things we talk about to improve the economic position of men in particular without college degrees needs to happen. But on the social messaging side, we need leaders from the federal level down to local level to be willing to point out that strengthening families needs to be an urgent policy matter. And we don't have, frankly, a very strong evidence based on what works in promoting strong families because it's not a policy priority. Our country spends gobs of money studying education interventions. There's a lot of research energy, there's a lot of federal dollars, there's a lot of philanthropic dollars going to education initiatives. We need that same amount of commitment and energy in the strengthening family space. And then we can come back in 3 years and say, hey, these programs are having big impacts on the community and we need to scale them up everywhere.
Love it. And then that really, right, it trickles down to all these other issues that we're spending so much time and energy on. I want to thank the three of you because I think this is a conversation we all need to continue. So I encourage you to read Dr. Kearney's Two-Parent Privilege. I encourage you to check out All Pro Dads. And is it All Star Moms too?
No, I'm Mom.
I'm on. So great tools, practical resources you should share with your family members. And then Brad's book, can we pre-order it?
Yes.
Let's pre-order Brad's book. So I want to thank you all, and I really want to encourage the rest of you, dig into this conversation, find these fantastic panelists as they're here the rest of the day, continue this conversation. So as I let you guys leave the stage, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, so let's do that.